You're not even gonna know that it happened.
My wife deserves vengeance. Doesn't make any difference whether I know about it. Just because there are things I don't remember doesn't make my actions meaningless. The world doesn't just disappear when you close your eyes, does it?
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Hollywood Gold. I'm Daniela Taplin-Lundberg, your host, and I'm here with Becca Camerata, my right-hand woman. Hey, Bex, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good to see you.
You too.
We're in the same place. We don't often get to record in the same place. I'm so excited.
And it's exciting to be, we're in this nice, cozy office on this very rainy New York day. It feels very appropriate to be talking about movies right now, because all you want to do is sit inside and watch a movie.
I'm really excited about today's episode. We're about to discuss Memento, which was Chris Nolan's first major feature that sort of put him on everyone's radar. And of course, Chris Nolan went on to produce like humongous blockbusters that were incredibly mind-bending, and Inception and Dunkirk and the Batman series with Christian Bale. And he's just one of our finest directors working today. We're going to talk to our friend Jennifer Todd, who is one of the lead producers on the film and sort of, I think, helped discover and launch him. So I am so excited to get going.
And with that, here's the conversation with Jen Todd.
So Jenny Todd, my good friend, my dear friend, my mentor, my former producing partner on a film that we will never forget.
For sure.
So as one of my dear friends, I wanted to do a deep dive into Memento, which is truly, I watched it again last week, one of the most innovative and great films. And I feel like you discovered truly one of the great filmmakers of our generation, right? Chris Nolan has just gone on to do like such extraordinary work, starting with that one. So I wanted you to sort of, through your lens, tell us the story of how it started, how it came to you, what the development process was like, and I'll sort of pepper you with questions, but why don't you just start with how the project came to you and what you liked about it?
Sure. It was, you always look back at these things and think, how did that come to be? It's interesting. I had met Aaron Ryder in passing a couple times. Great guy. I think you know him as well. And we had a drink right before I was leaving to make a movie called Boiler Room in New York. And he was like, we really should work together. And I was like, I'd love to. He was working at Newmarket Capital with Will and Chris, who ran that company and financed the film. And while I was in New York, he sent me the script. What I didn't know, the backstory, is that Chris and he are really close friends, and he was sort of internally shepherding his friend's movie at his company. But he said, you know, read this and see what you like. And I have told this story a few times before, so forgive me, but I remember it was night in New York. I was still reading a paper script. Someone had FedExed me. These were those days. And I got in a script and I got into bed and I kept trying to read it. And I was like, I said it read like stereo instructions. I think it just was so complicated. And I was taking notes. And I remember really clearly thinking, oh, well, at some point it'll stop, and it'll just run forward, But since the script never did that, I remember very carefully putting it down and thinking, I'm going to have a cup of coffee in the morning and read this again, And then I loved it. It took many reads. And even still, like, you can imagine how fun it was to unpack the puzzle. And I wish I could tell you I developed the script, but I really didn't. There were very small changes between that point and making the movie. They sent me Following, which was Chris's first film.
Yeah, and tell me about that.
That was super inventive. I mean, I haven't watched it since then, but I just remember it was about somebody following people and somebody starts to follow him. It had like a really clever twist, and I thought this was great. And I flew back to LA, and my sister and I met with Chris, who is, the cool thing about him, he's kind of the same guy he was then. He's very smart. He's very calm, cool, and collected. He had the whole movie kind of in his head. And I remember really distinctively thinking, I wonder if anyone will want to see if this movie will be almost too smart for its own good. I remember thinking, well, my film school geek friends will like this. Like there'll be, I knew that there was a level for film lovers. So I was like, of course, let's go for it.
Did he pitch you his vision? Because like, obviously reading, even watching it is so complex and intellectual. When he pitched it, did it warm it up for you a bit? Or were you just like, I'm going to trust this guy's a genius?
I could tell he had it in his, I was more about questions, about confusion, because you can imagine just reading it, not seeing it executed. Just the the way that black and white runs forward, but the color runs backward, but the first scene is run backwards. It was more, I think, more me peppering him with questions. And we talked a little bit, I'm sure, about cast and where to make the movie. I know that we kind of, for a minute, tried on like Canada and stuff. And I think at the time, we shot it in late summer. And I think both Suzanne and I kind of advocated for LA because we didn't have very much money. And I had worked on bigger films too. And I was like, we can get great crew to stay in LA to work for cheaper because people at this point in the, people want to be home if they could be, and it was a quick shoot. So we ended up shooting it mostly out in the Deep Val, which you're familiar with.
Yeah, and like you and Suzanne had done bigger movies at that point. We just talked about like independent films being so difficult, right? Like they just, like you're not paid as much, but you're working twice as hard. Why did you guys decide to go for it?
This as a producer, you can't pick and choose what gets made when. And I always think people are so funny when they're like, why did you make this movie then? You're like, because I found the money, like the money came through. That's why. I have a shelf full of movies I love that also didn't get made, if you want to talk about those. But that year in particular, it was interesting. In 1999, Suzanne and I made Boiler Room. At the very top of the year, I was in New York. That's what I was reading. And then we made a sequel to our HBO film, If These Walls Could Talk 2. In the spring. And so this was actually the third thing we were filming. So it was a really interesting year for us. It was a busy year for us in that way. And I think we were just still at that point, I think I was 29. And I think I was still just sort of
oh my God,
trying out. I know, now I'm 100. But I think that, I think we were still experimenting kind of with our own taste of things we liked. There for as many of these movies that I love and really believe in, there were the other things that came by that spoke to other people that didn't speak to me, So this movie it's clever. It was so ambitious. You couldn't not want to try to make it.
So you met with Chris. At that point, was Aaron Ryder, who was essentially financing the film and had sort of developed it with Chris. Is that right?
They were friends. I didn't realize they were great friends. And I think Aaron was sort of, young and earlier in his career and was trying to kind of get it done. And I think wanted to bring in producers of stature or whatever at the time to kind of help him get it done there. So he was very instrumental in all of it and a great guy. But yeah, it was sort of, his vision, I think, was to get this movie and his friend's movie made at Newmarket.
And was it the type of thing where they were going to finance it based on cast, or were they just going to finance it?
Yeah, I think it was a dance. I remember, we ended up making the movie for I believe it was $4 million. And we definitely had to have some, I'm trying to remind myself who took international, but I think we definitely had to do a little bit of a dance with cast. And they were really cool, Will and Chris, but they were like, there's no more money. You know what I mean? Like they were very cool, like, we'll do this, but this is what it is. But honestly, when you watch the movie, which you just did, you'll realize like those three central characters are never even in a scene together. That's what's amazing. It's actually, it's very simple in execution. It's just complicated in the way it's put together. Do you know what I mean? Like, but the scenes, like I said, it's like they're never even three people in a scene. It's everything's very isolated. And so we could shoot it rather quickly, especially because Chris is so, decisive and has, he's such a clear director. It's no wonder he became what he did because he had such chops even then. Like everything you kind of want in a director, which is open to suggestions and ideas, but a really clear vision.
Can pivot if he needs to, but knows what he wants.
Completely. And like, even back then, ego so in check that it's like a good idea is still a good idea and I'll take it and make it my own because I'm a director and I'm not afraid of anybody giving me an idea, but I have a really clear vision to instill in the crew and the cast so that they feel strong.
Okay, so you decided to shoot in LA. I want to talk about casting and then I want to talk about your crew. I'd read an interview with you and Suzanne that like there was all sorts of actors sort of circling the role that Guy Pearce ultimately took. So what was that? Like, what was that process?
It actually wasn't that many. We did go to Brad Pitt, who took a couple months to think about it. And I'll never forget, I got a call from Kevin Uvain telling me he was passing. And then Kevin called me back like 5 minutes later and said, have you gone to somebody else yet? And I said, no. He's like, he still wants to think about it, which was so sweet. And years ago, I saw him and Kevin he's like, he still knows that, that you're the one that offered him Memento, which is so unbelievably lovable. And obviously he was great. That was like our one big reach. After that, we really it was interesting. There was just a couple. I mean, I hate to talk about casting because it's
I know
about people who didn't get it other than Brad Pitt. But the interesting thing about Guy is I remember talking to somebody or involved, and I remember just sitting on the floor of my office with 2 cassette tapes. It's so sad, VHS tapes, and I had LA Confidential and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert in my hands. And I was like, this is the same guy. Look at his performances. Yeah. He is the same guy. And I think what's great about Guy, and he's still so underrated as an actor, is because he's such a chameleon and you can't believe he was those same 2 guys. But also he still had a likability, and you still had to be rooting for a guy who possibly killed his wife, right?
Right.
So I think in the end, that's why he was such a great choice.
Right.
He's an unbelievable actor.
And then I remember you sort of telling me a story about Carrie Ann Moss and Joey Pants, and that was sort of like at the height of The Matrix, right?
Yeah, like absolutely. And like I said, we needed some foreign value, and The Matrix had just come out. We were all kind of obsessed with the movie and talking about it, and it's a very different film, but it has a similar language as Memento in some ways, the complications of it. So we went to her, and then we were trying to cast Teddy, and she suggested Joey Pants. She said, and I'll never forget, she said, he's a good luck charm. We should cast him.
Well, it's so funny. I watched an interview with Chris Nolan, who was like, very publicly was like reluctant to cast Joey Pants for whatever reason. Do you remember that sort of dialogue?
Yeah, well, we had other ideas. We'd gotten a couple of passes. And then we were like, and that was her idea. And he was sort of, it's sweet that he was, that he talks about it. But he ended up being amazing and so perfect for the part that you can't, it's so funny with casting, you can't imagine anybody else playing that part, you know?
Well, Joey Pants is also such a chameleon. Like that guy is in every movie and everyone forgets.
Yeah, I know. I just watched him in something recently that I couldn't believe he was in. But yeah, that came from Carrie Ann, which is so sweet because they just worked together.
Looks like somebody's home.
That thing's been here for years.
What are you talking about? These tracks are only a few days old.
Tracks? What are you, Pocahontas?
Were there a lot of rehearsal? Like, did you guys have a chance to do rehearsal, or was it such a short schedule?
I don't remember a lot of rehearsing, to be honest. What was cool about it, we'll get into it, is just that the departments loved the challenge of the movie, like the crew and the cast. I think it was all a lot of the order in which things happen in the movie and the order in which we shot. Like you could imagine how bananas that was.
Okay, so talk about that. How was that extra challenging?
Yeah, I remember it was so fun. I remember standing next to Kristen, the prop guy coming over with Polaroids, and how many Polaroids, and then Guy was like, at what point, how much writing is on this one, and in what order do we put them? And a lot of the departments had the movie, they had a version of the script, in chronological order, obviously, and then had to have it by scene. So it was just such a fun challenge to always be thinking about, we're questioning. And like I said, then you also had the black and white versus the color. So it was just a Rubik's Cube, and it was really fun.
I mean, did your script supervisor go on to tremendously great things? I just know on little films where you have there's a adjustment of the picture from the first scene to the third scene to the 10th scene. I can't imagine the Polaroids, how complicated that was.
He just did. I just saw Steve. He does a lot of Chris's movies. And I just worked with him on, what did I just see him on? City on a Hill, I think? Or anyways, he's a fantastic script supervisor. And yeah, you can imagine he had a challenging job on that. No wonder Chris has hung on to him, I think, and used him.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I remember that everybody loved it. Everybody people were so game for the challenge of it,
Did he know what kind of crew he wanted? I mean, he was new to LA, right? He didn't have a network yet.
No, but he I kind of think if he'd worked with Wally, or he definitely had Wally in mind. Wally was definitely his guy. And I cannot, to be honest, remember where Dodie, he hadn't worked with any of them, but I can't quite remember how we got her in the mix. I remember John Papsadera came from us, and Cindy Evans came from us. I remember who's somebody I really liked a lot and had been trying to work with. She was the costume designer. And John still works with him to this day, and he had done Austin Powers and a couple things for Suzanne and I, so we had kind of brought them in the mix. And a lot of these people, some of them did a couple of his movies, and some of them continue to this day. And obviously, Wally, got to have a directing career of his own after Chris kind of nurtured him. So a couple of them we went out and found, and then a couple of them we brought to the game. So
I actually saw an image of you in a still with Chris, and you were just a baby. Talk about the shoot a little bit. Was it grueling? Was it fun? Was it like lighthearted? Was it intense? Every set has its own vibe.
So Chris is like, it was hot as hell because it was like the valley in late summer, Chris, I think he still does this day, always wears a suit jacket, like out of respect to the crew, which is great. It was like really calm and efficient, like not a set where any great problems happened, because even back then he was in complete control over managing everything. And we didn't have any trailers or anything. I remember sitting with Guy Pearce on like folding chairs on a lawn, waiting to go back to. But, it's like when you're all making the same movie, it's all okay, and Joey would make it fun, and it just was mind-boggling hot. And one day I remember I was crammed in, it was Sammy Jenkins' house. We were crammed in this little house, and we were at the monitor, and it was a really long take, and I started feeling woozy, and I had to put my hand on the floor, and I was like, oh my God, let me just get through this take. I'm so embarrassed, like I can't ruin this. And I ran outside to this, they yelled cut, and I ran outside to kind of put my head between my legs, and Guy came and sat next to me, and he goes, I'm a fainter too. And I was like, oh, I'm so mortified. But it was just like hot, sweaty, claustrophobic. We were in, look at the locations. Everywhere we were was pretty small and tight.
So like that little hotel room and that little house, everything was so cramped. Your set design, your set deck must have been really that was nothing, right? It wasn't that complex.
Wardrobe was just multiples, you know what I mean? It was just blood and things like that. But it was more about the order in which things happen. Like imagine the tattoo, just tracking the tattoos.
Yeah.
It just had a lot of organization to it that no movie, that I've ever worked on has had since then, because you had to be like, what stage is this Polaroid in at that point?
Right.
And at some point he destroys the Polaroid, that kind of thing. And and then which tattoos are the correct ones and all of that. That's what was really fun.
So when he was getting the tattoos done, you didn't see his chest in every scene, so he must have just done that a couple days, right? But how long did that process take?
It was definitely about, those days took longer for sure, but you're right, there weren't that many, but it was more about which ones do I have at which time. Obviously you see them a lot in the motel. And then at the end he throws in, there's that extra tattoo that says I did it when he's laying with his wife, which is weird fantasy. It's like a...
Oh, totally. That shot always is it's actually a cue for me going into other films, that little nugget of a shot that totally blows your mind.
Yeah, or when you see him as Sammy Jenkins. So
yeah. And Chris Nolan, some directors I find they're all about the actors, right? And some directors are all about the screenplay and just getting what their vision is from the screenplay to film, and some are just about the style of it all. What kind of director did you observe him to be in terms of interacting with cast, interacting with crew?
I think he's pretty even-keeled about all of it. It was interesting because Jonah, his younger brother, who wrote the story, was a set PA. And I would always tease him. He was also crazy young at the time, I think just out of college. But it was funny. I was like, you've got to be the only person who wrote a movie and is also working on the set. But they're just calm, cool, and efficient family. And also the funny thing about Jonah is he went to school in Chicago, so he doesn't have an English accent, but they're brothers.
Oh.
Yes. So, which is really fun.
How did that happen? They're brothers. Chris grew up in...
Yeah, it was a school thing of where they went. And like I said, I think Jonah came to America first, but, obviously he's doing quite okay in his career as well. But yeah, he was a set PA, which, like I said, was fun. We would tease him about it even then.
And did Chris and Jonah sort of confer at all on set, or was Jonah really just a set PA and getting coffee or cleaning up or whatever?
I think a little bit, but I think Jonah was still so new to it like I said, if I was 29, they're younger than me. So imagine, I can't, if we look it up, I can't remember. We all feels like children now, but I mean, but back then
everyone was in their 20s.
Yeah, we were young.
Yeah.
The interesting thing too is that they had me, Aaron and Chris were like, we want you to meet the woman we want to hire as Chris's assistant. And she was amazing. And I was like, of course you should hire her. And it was Emma Thomas. And they didn't tell me that it was Chris's girlfriend. And I was like, what if I hadn't liked her at the time? Like, that's so terrible. She was, of course, amazing and is now his wife and producer. So, of course, I'm not an idiot. She was fantastic. She had been working for, I believe, Working Title at the time. But they made me interview her. This was so sweet. They wanted to be so professional that even though she was his girlfriend, it should have been like, yeah, of course you can be my assistant. They're like, you have to meet the producer and, make sure she's okay with you. And she ended up doing so much on the movie. She ended up being, I think, an associate. We gave her an associate producer credit at the time or something. But it was very funny.
I was so curious about that. She was hired as his assistant, which is so hilarious. But did you immediately note sort of producerial abilities from her?
She was just crazy efficient. Yeah, like she was just one of those people that you were like, oh, we got this. If anything, like the interesting thing is about, which we'll get to, is the filming of the movie wasn't the dramatic part of it. You know what I mean? It was the aftermath of it. But like between Emma and Aaron and Chris and the size and scope, and that we actually, we did have enough money. It was a small movie, but like I said, we got great people in LA. It actually went really pretty swimmingly. I think we needed like an extra half day at the end, I remember. And it was like not even a full day of going over on a 25-day shoot.
So there were no pickups. Like it was just so precise that you got what you needed going into the edit. There was really only one way to edit it, right?
One of the only movies I've ever produced that did not do pickups.
No one realizes how important pickups are to movies that work. Like it's so rare just to shoot and be done.
My God, most of the movies I've done, the majority, I would say 90, so that was interesting. And it was done in truth, his cut, I remember giving notes on a few cuts and they were all so surgical at that point. Everything was very, everything is so tied together in the execution of it. There wasn't a lot of room to like pull anything apart once it was put together.
You saw a cut that he presented after presumably like 10 weeks or whatever it is, or maybe earlier. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and I have a great story about that. It was interesting. He was so nervous about security, which I think he still is. But I think one of the things that made him extra worried about that is I was cutting Boiler Room at the time. But Boiler Room didn't originally have narration in it, and we added it to the movie before it was done. And so we had done a test run of the movie with narration, and again, remember this is VHS tape days, and we had sent it to our executives at New Line, a couple of them, and like a week
with the
narration for approval, to say, hey, this is a new cut of the movie, while I was working on Memento, and I can't remember exactly where we were in it, but I got a phone call from an agent who's like, oh my God, I loved your movie, I watched it, and I was like, what are you talking about? And then somebody at New Line, I assume an assistant, had made copies of the movie. This movie was still so rough. It wasn't the cut. It wasn't, by the way, it was Ben Younger's voice doing the narration. It wasn't Giovanni's. We were just showing it to say, hey, this is what we want to do with the movie. And and like I said, maybe 3 copies had gone over there. But anyway, someone had copied it and I kept getting, it made me insane. And I told Chris the story, or he overheard me on the phone, and he was like, oh my God, that can never happen. So I do remember in my mind, when you're asking me about seeing the cut, I'm sitting in a screening room. I mean, I remember I watched the cut in a screening room. I did not have a tape of the movie. I never had a tape of the movie. I mean, and I don't blame him. He was already worried enough about it. And then I had scared him with this terrible story about our movie getting sent around. You can imagine as a producer, and I would say, that's not the movie. And they're like, oh, no, who cares? I liked it. And you're like, it hadn't been mixed. It hadn't, it was...
It's your worst nightmare, your baby going out into the world.
Yeah, it was so I feel like I added to his need for security,
His fear.
Yeah.
Okay, so the film was pretty much cut in his head. He was that kind of filmmaker from the get-go, which sort of, accounts for how successful he has become. So the post-process sort of felt like it wasn't that dramatic, or were there any moments that felt like, oh, we're wrestling or we're not on the same page?
No, it was so swimmingly efficient. It really was. Like I said, it's so interesting. So many movies are so different in what process that they're painful, but this one was painful in its afterlife. You know.
Ooh, I can't wait to hear.
You don't know who you are.
I'm Leonard Shelby. I'm from San Francisco.
That's who you were. That's not what you become.
So it was an independent film, meaning you had to go sell it to a studio. And how did you guys do that? What were the next steps once you felt it was ready?
Yeah, so we had our cut, which was pretty much it. And I remember helping to get this David Bowie song which was really cool that we could get that. That was a big deal for Chris. And then we, along with Newmarket, like I said, those guys were great, Will and Chris, we said, we're going to screen the movie Oscar weekend for buyers because everybody was in town. And long ago, I had worked for Miramax, and Harvey had started and Añez had started calling me about the movie and pushing up on me and how they had to see it first. And I was getting lots of aggressive Miramax calls. So the Saturday before the Oscars, this is 2000, so the night before, we held a bunch of screenings. And I covered the Miramax one, Aaron covered one, and Suzanne covered one. And the other ones had multiple buyers at them, but Miramax got their own. And basically, I sat next to Harvey, and at the end of the movie, he turned to me and said, the movie's not for us. He's a really talented filmmaker. We should find something else to do with him, but I can't buy the movie, basically. And there were tons of Miramax. There were a lot of the people you and I know in the screening sitting behind us. But, so he passed. And then we were calling each other, and basically nobody was stepping up to buy the movie. And it was super depressing. And we were like, you know what, let's just meet at the Four Seasons for a drink and we'll all collect. And we show up at the Four Seasons, but it's the night before the Oscars and it's packed and we can't get into the bar. So it was so painful that we ended up at Kate Manalini's. God bless it, it's gone now. We ended up at Kate Manalini's. I remember so depressed in a booth of like, oh my God. And I think like Emma and Jonah were there. I can't remember all the characters, but it was like, we were all so bummed. And I remember Paramount was kind of floating like some kind of like a VOD, like it was pre this, but you know what I mean? They were floating something, but that was all we had. And so we were pretty devastated. And, not that night, but soon after, Will and Chris were like, we really believe in the movie. And they were like, we're going to hire... Who were the principals?
Will who and Chris who?
Will Tyre and Chris Ball, whose company is Newmarket, and Aaron worked with them. So we decided to do festivals. We ended up doing Venice, Toronto, Sundance. But they also hired Bob Burney. They were like, we know this guy, Bob. Now, at the time, Bob Burney had helped Todd Solondz with a movie called Happiness that was having release issues because it was so controversial. And now, obviously, Bob Burney's became the big guru. So they hired him to kind of do the strategy and do their own release of the film. Oh. So they had never released a film before. And they, I think they gave him $1 million, but I can't, I remember that number being, again, forgive me if I got any of these details wrong because it's been 20 years. But
sure, I know.
But so what happened is, we went to. What was great is we went to Venice, which was so fun, and they were so sweet to bring us all there, and the movie played great, as you can imagine, and because Europeans just get it. And I remember we all went out to a great dinner afterwards, and we argued a little bit about the end of the movie. Because Emma and I were like, isn't there a version where Sammy Jenkins really did exist, and he didn't kill his wife?
Right.
And we had like a really fun, lively conversation about it. And I remember in that moment thinking, what movie would I ever make where you could still talk about the end of the movie? At this point, it had been a year since we'd made it, and we were having this kind of lively conversation about it. And I think Chris, even though I do believe that you're, meant to believe he killed his wife, but he left the question mark for you. So if you could see, that there was really the guy and he didn't kill his wife. So, but it was pretty spectacular that we could be doing that.
So Jen, to go Venice, Toronto, and then Sundance is pretty unusual, right? Like
Right.
either you premiere at Sundance, you sell your movie, and then you'll do like an Oscar run in the fall season, which is when Venice and Toronto run. But what was the reasoning behind doing those three?
I think again, and it was more Bob and Will and Chris, but I think they were just trying to get good, get reviews, win some awards. I believe Chris won the screenplay award at Sundance. It definitely got some attention, and then it came out. I'll never forget that Christmas, I went on safari in Africa. So this was December before we did Sundance and then before the movie opened. And I was sitting in Kenya, and you like eat with other families. And this gorgeous 16-year-old French girl starts talking about this movie that she loved and she'd seen 3 times over, and she made her family go see it. And it was Memento. And it was so incredible. And I remember being like, having that crazy moment where I was like, oh my God, maybe people will see this movie. And then I was like, oh, they're European, they're French,
different.
they're smarter than us.
Totally.
They get it. They like interesting cinema. I don't know that America is going to feel the same way, but it was it was just an amazing moment.
So was it out internationally before it was released domestically?
It was, and I could look up the dates, which I didn't have in front of me, sorry, but it did come out internationally first, and I think maybe because of exactly that, because I think they were thinking
it'll work.
Because of the cleverness of it, it would work there. So,
do you remember when it was released in the U.S.?
It was May, so it was a little bit later.
Okay, so spring release.
And here, I have all the numbers in front of me. That's so funny. Look, France was October 2000, which is why the French girl could talk about it. So it was out for quite a bit. It was out in the UK. So we were, it had a big, and again, I think that was deliberative. Bob, who is obviously knew what he was talking about, because I think that the international numbers helped us have a life.
Drove the domestic interest.
Yeah, and I think also gave them confidence to put a little more money in the movie. So
Right. Okay, so then it came out, and do you remember what the reaction was from the domestic market press?
The movie played in theaters for 6 months. I do remember that.
Wow.
It was back in a day when a movie could sit, and it sat, and I remember it, I think it got to 25 domestic at that time, which was obviously huge for I like it says the budget was 9, the budget was 4.
Okay.
Yeah, we made it to 25.5, and our worldwide gross was 40.
Incredible.
Not bad, right? And you know what? It was like a slow and steady. It would people would find it, and I had one of the best phone calls where I got a message that on a weekend a friend of mine was like, Rob Reiner wants to talk to you. And I called him, and he and Michelle were on the phone, and they're like, we just watched Memento, and we have a lot of questions for you. And then I'll never forget, he was like, Dad, Carl, Jen's on the phone, pick up. And so I had a conference call with Carl, Rob, and Michelle Reiner to explain the movie to them. And I was like, this is pretty cool. To talk about it was just great. There were many of those, but that was one that stuck in my brain. And so it was really fun. And a lot of them, including Harvey, kind of circled back on the movie, wanted to help support a campaign. And at that point, I believe, I can't speak for them, but those Will and Chris were like, we got this. Thank you very much. They had done, they had also done the big brave move, which is, self-distributing a movie, you know what I mean? Which was amazing. So, at that time was pretty remarkable,
It got pretty widely recognized. It was nominated for several
he
awards.
Won. I do remember we went to the DGA. He got a DGA nomination, which was pretty huge at that point. And I remember that year it was Baz Luhrmann, Ridley Scott, Ron Howard, and Peter Jackson, and Chris. And we were literally like the tiny movie, so that was really cool. We didn't have a big award, there was no awards money, so we got 2 Oscar nominations. I wish we had gotten obviously picture. There were only 5 pictures back then too, and then we cleaned up at the Spirit Awards.
Right,
we did
of course.
Yeah,
we
did really
your
well
people.
there.
They really embraced you. But do you remember sort of observing the rise of Chris? I've seen that happen a couple times where you start at the beginning of a award season where no one knows who the filmmaker is, and then by the end, he's the most famous, biggest person in the room. Did you sort of observe that at all, or you remember that?
Absolutely, and Soderbergh kind of swooped in, and a lot of people were swooping in to help and promote, and figure out what like to do. And obviously he and it was, I think it was back when Soderbergh and Clooney were still partners. And I believe, did they produce Insomnia? Who produced that movie? That was his next.
Oh.
That was his next movie after ours. But yeah, he was becoming rightly so the new great thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it was interesting to see people come in. I remember Elvis Mitchell being like a really early champion of the movie, and Chris's and talking it up. And it was funny. I remember an executive, I was at Sundance, was taking credit for helping the movie and didn't realize I had produced it. So, there were all those kind of great Hollywood moments for sure. But you could tell, like I said, it wasn't, I'm trying to think, I'm looking to see who produced Insomnia. I'm pretty sure it was those guys, right? Hang on.
I think that's
It was
right.
Warner's. It was Warner's, where he had his long company. Oh yeah, Soderbergh was an executive producer. Oh, they were the EPs on it. Yeah, so I think they were early. Look good, early spotters of talent, obviously. So, and to Chris's credit, I know he got offered a ton and has only ever been like,
I'm going to do my own thing.
Yeah.
So Jen, like there's certain movies in our lives, you're sort of a family, and they're the ones that sort of you remember always, and you love those people so much through thick and thin. Was this one of those movies for you? Was Memento that for you? Or was it more sort of segmented, fragmented?
It was such a long journey that I still feel so close to, like, I keep in touch with all of them. And Chris is always really kind, and Chris and Emma always invite us to like an early screening of their movies. And when I get there, it's a lot of the same people. Like, they keep their life, because I think they've had such extraordinary success. I think they keep themselves very contained and focused, which is completely admirable. But no, we all felt like it was 20 years ago, but we felt like such a family by the end of it, and like so much respect for the people, and like the fact that the movie came so close to, not having the deserved life that it had,
I know, like so many of it's so great to hear the stories of the movies that almost didn't happen, or didn't have a life, or didn't have a theatrical release, because it's like, it's the luck of the draw, right? It's like.
Absolutely. I mean, I know it's a Harvey Weinstein story, but I used to have hanging on my office. I had a fax he sent me that said, "Dear Jennifer, every day I tell everyone how stupid I am for passing on Memento." So he did own it with me. I know that to other people there were, a lot of people saw this movie and didn't see it, and I mean, like that's okay. That's what it, but. But we're lucky that Will and Chris were so passionate about it and kind of believed it, and
Totally.
And happy that that you could do things like do the festivals then and that. I mean, right now, otherwise today they would just sell it to a streamer, right?
And no one would see it, or maybe a few people would, but it just wouldn't have the same life. Any other like little things that you remember, or little anecdotes, or do you feel like we really covered all the bases?
There was one moment, now I remember, they did a 10-year anniversary screening of the movie that we all went to. It was very sweet, 10 years after the movie came out, and I probably hadn't watched it in that 10 years. And I remember Chris and I went together, and Chris Messina, not Chris Nolan, and Guillermo del Toro interviewed Chris Nolan after the movie, and a lot of the original crew came. It was really fun. We all saw each other, and I did remember we watched this movie. I hadn't seen it, probably in close to 10 years, and I was like, it really holds up. Like, it's a really good movie. Like, sometimes you watch a movie and later and you're like, oh, this feels so dated. It was of the moment. What did I like about this movie? I was like, oh, pretty good. I'm pretty proud of this one,
It's so funny. Really I totally agree. I watched it last week, and I was just like, you choose these movies because they feel like they are legacy films, right? That's like the whole purpose of this podcast. And I was like, God, I hope it holds up. And it really does. I mean, it's so tight.
Yeah, and I mean, that was obviously over 10 years ago, was the 10-year reunion. So, but it was fun, and obviously, and it was interesting to see Guillermo treat it with such reverence. He was like, and this movie, and Emma was there. Like, because it was all about what Chris had become in the 10 years since then, too. But it was so fun for all of us to sit there and watch. But at the end, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty proud of this one. I also think the movie just and it's something to think, it has such a timelessness to it that it also doesn't feel, other than Cars, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have a lot of elements to date it.
But it's also like not political. It's just like a great story. It's a really tight story.
Right. So therefore, it can kind of live in any time as opposed to in something so specific. Unlike Boiler Room, which I love, but it really like go back and watch that and I go, oh, this was a moment in New York that came, that has come and gone, and it's kind of great in a different way because you remember that. You go back in time. You go back in time when you watch that one,
Right.
But just the phones and the
suits are kind of bigger. And
oh my God! And Ben Affleck's quoting, always be closing, and he's quoting Glengarry and White. It like just has such a specificity of time to it,
right?
And so that's another interesting thing about this movie that you're not really thinking about that when you're making it, but 22 years later, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that it lends to its timelessness,
I have to believe in a world outside my own mind. I have to believe that my actions still have meaning, even if I can't remember them. I have to believe that when my eyes are closed, the world's still there.
So, Bex, what an awesome episode from a true sort of Hollywood insider. Talking to Jen for me is always talking to like the cool older girl in high school who's being nice to you, and she just like knows the ways of the world, and I'm just trying to keep up. But she's obviously such a strong, thoughtful producer and really knows how to handle talent and has an eye for story. So what did you think of the whole tale?
I loved it. Like you said, she's such an iconic producer. She has made some really incredible films. And you said at the beginning that she was kind of an inspiration for you as a female producer.
Yeah.
And I see the connection between what you do in your work and what she does when she said that part of the reason she signed on to produce Memento was because of how challenging it would be. And I just loved that because she was like, this is good. No one else is going to want to produce this. It's going to be so hard.
Yeah.
I love the line that she said she got the script and it read like stereo instructions.
Yeah. Oh, I love that too.
And one, I think that would have been really fun to produce. But you and I know how challenging a movie like that would have been to produce. Yeah. So the fact that she was able to see the talent in Chris Nolan when a lot of other people didn't, even after the movie was made, it was really hard for them to sell it.
Yeah.
She had such foresight into how incredible of a filmmaker he would become. So I was really impressed with her being able to see that and being willing to take on such a challenging movie.
And I think, Jen was so young at that time, but she had this company called Team Todd, and she was partners with her sister, Suzanne. And Jen was only 29 years old, I think, when she produced Memento, but she had already produced significant studio movies. She had done the Austin Powers series and was really an established producer. So in a way, Jen was sort of lifting a new young talent up and sort of taking a shot on him. And man, did that pay off. What an incredible experience to work with someone who went on to be, one of our finest directors. But I loved the little tidbits. Chris Nolan wears a suit jacket to work every day. I just love hearing those little details about, how different filmmakers handle their sets and their crews and how they organize their shoots.
I loved that as well because you and I have been on many film sets. They're long days, they're hard days, they're exhausting days.
Yeah.
And so to have your director show up and respect you in that way as a crew member, I think is so great for morale on set. And, you and I have come up with some creative ways to keep the morale up on especially late night shoots, cold shoots, really hard
Coffee
shoots.
trucks,
Coffee
donuts,
yes.
hot pizza.
The best. So I really respect that level of commitment to the craft and also appreciation for the people who are helping you make it.
That's right. And they seem to be, friends to this day. It's also funny that Chris, I love the anecdote about Emma, his then assistant girlfriend, who then went on to be a very, very successful producer and partner to Chris Nolan in every movie he makes. But just that, they were so sweet that they wanted Jen to interview her and give her the job on her own merit, not because she was dating the director. I thought that was so great.
One of my other favorite moments was when she was saying she got on a conference call with Carl and Rob Reiner.
Yes.
After they had seen the movie and they had so many questions. They're like, wait, you have to explain this to us.
I know.
when I think back about moments that inspired me to work in film, I remember watching Inception in theaters and just being, like you said, like my mind was totally blown.
100%.
Didn't know you could make a movie like that. That would just, the twists and the turns and the timeline warps and all of this stuff. I was so blown away by that. So to recognize that, oh, Christopher Nolan's mind has always worked this way, and his brother's mind has always worked this way, that they could get people like Carl Reiner and Rob Reiner, who are legends in the industry, to call Jennifer Todd and be like, what's going on? That was really cool to hear, that he's always been working like this, and that, like we said before, that Jennifer Todd could see that he was this brilliant mind and took a risk on him and helped get this film made.
It's funny, coming up through independent film, there's a lot of scripts that come through our office that feel like they're sort of imitations of other things that have been successful. And I think with Nolan, what an original mind. Just the concept of the film itself, and like the intricacy of like one story going forward and one story going backward, and then like the entire thing revealed in the final shot of the film. It still blows my mind, the kind of mind you have to keep all of that organized. It's just next level, and he seemed to be a really humble human being too. That was the other thing that Jen communicated, that he was like kind to his crew and so respectful and just was very easygoing and humble. I just love that.
I also appreciated when you said that the ending of this film has inspired you to want to put some sort of twist or button at the end of
always
films. I laughed when I heard you say that, because I've heard you say that to me so many times. Like, we'll be giving notes on a movie or a script or something. You're like, well, what if we put this reveal in right here? And I didn't know that that's where that came from, but you do that all the time, and it's so brilliant.
Bex, I think we're both talking about the same project, but we just want that final scene to just bring the whole thing together, right?
Yes, always.
Oh man, it's the plight of producers trying to develop a material. You always want to just like blow people away in the final moment and have them leave the theater or their television screen just being like, what was that? Talking about it. And that Memento really did that. So what an awesome episode. Thanks, Bex, for being with me again. To our listeners, please follow us at Stay Gold Features on Instagram. Email us podcast@staygoldfeatures.com and leave us your reviews and DM us with any movies you want us to explore. I think, we're having so much fun with this. And subscribe whenever you're listening. I think that'll just encourage us to keep going with this awesome podcast. So thanks, guys.